Hello and welcome back. I am the Clay Golem, and in this video we're having a look at gardening. Medieval gardening and farms in particular, as part of this series of trying to bring your D&D worlds to life and give them a bit of depth and make them feel real and make your players care about your average peasant, which is really important if you want your world to feel alive. So whenever the party travels from a dungeon to town, between towns, villages, etc., you'll probably give some kind of description as they approach that town about, you ride past rolling fields, peasant farms, and that's kind of it. It's a little bit flat. But in your head, you're probably imagining, fields of sweet corn growing, or wheat blowing in the breeze, or perhaps row upon rows of cabbages. Well, in our heads, those kind of fantasy farms are normally like that. And when you look at a lot of fantasy maps, that's exactly what they're like. Big, open fields with the same crop, like you would see in modern farming techniques. And they're wrong. So, real medieval agriculture? It wasn't flat, it wasn't neat, and nobody was buying in sacks of fertiliser to put onto their crops, etc. That's a bit of a fallacy. So while the medieval farm is a really important part of our landscape in our fantasy settings, we want to focus a bit more on the smaller detail and have a look at gardens in particular. So we're going to look at the average human peasant's garden. Why humans? Well, elves, gnomes, dwarves, they have a different approach to this. They live in different environments. Dwarves living underground, for example. So I think we're probably going to need to do a separate video on giving you some ideas of what a dwarf farm looks like. What does farming look like for elves? And of course, your world is a fantasy world. So this is only to kind of inform and give you ideas of how you can develop that. You can do what you like, and you can stick with very basic, it's a farm, and not go into any detail. But I would encourage you to think about putting more depth into those. So a real fantasy cottage is a living machine. It's not just a dwelling. We're talking about gardens or plots of land with laid hawthorn hedges that are woven so thick that animals are not passing through. That includes horses, that includes gallivanting goblins and everything else. They are actually really quite defensive, but a lot of that is about keeping animals out and stopping them eating your stuff rather than actually to keep armies out, but they certainly will work like that. So already, just by mentioning that kind of hedging, we're already looking at tactical things that our gardens can do as part of our adventures and stuff, which is cool. We're also looking at things like sturdy wattle fencing and plant beds that are made from coppiced willow. And we'll get on to what the heck is coppicing and what we mean by coppiced willow. And I'm sure you're going to see some images throughout this and you go, oh yeah, I know what you're talking about. I never knew that's what it was called. Because, you know a lot of this stuff. You just never brought it together or realised what the historical time frame for some of this stuff is. So we've got fences around the outside, natural fences, not white picket fences. That's a complete no, that's a modern invention. We don't want to be doing that. We've got wattle beds that are raised off the ground in a lot of cases for very good reasons. We've got fermentation hotbeds using steaming manure from our various cattle and things that allows us to grow our green crops for longer in the year than the local climate normally would allow. So right up until the first frosts and beyond by using the heat from that manure. But we'll come back to that in more detail. You may have heard, or you may not have heard, of things called earthen clamps, which is a way of storing food. Before refrigeration, we haven't got that. Of course, this is D&D for a lot of us, or Pathfinder, or whatever your fantasy thing is, and you absolutely can have wizards and clerics and things creating ice for refrigeration and stuff like that? Of course you can. We're talking about your average peasant that doesn't have access to those kind of magics. So earthen clamps, we can store our winter rations in those directly in the frozen ground, and we just take out what we need. The medieval refrigerator, basically. Before we get into the detail, I should point out that a lot of this in this video we're going to cover is based on research on the writings of a gentleman called John Gardner. Yes, there's a reason we call it gardening. John Gardner, who wrote a treatise and a poem called The Fate of Gardening from 1440. So this is not a modern idea of what this stuff is. This is actually somebody writing down, this is what we grew and this is the techniques that we used. So it's about as accurate as we are going to get. And the reason we call it gardening is because of John Gardner. So it all comes from that. There we go. The more you know. But why should you care about historical compost, clay-thumbed pots and everything else in your D&D? Well, because this is what turns your generic fantasy backdrop into a living, breathing world where your players can hide inside, a 200-year-old coppice grove and seek shelter, or use the farms like Earth Clamp as an emergency bunker during an orc raid. Realise that the local lord is hoarding all of the pigeon dung. And that's interrupting the local food supplies. Suddenly your world starts to have weight, and you're starting to see that these different items can be used as plot devices for your adventures. There's an issue over here and you need to solve it, rather than, oh yeah, there's rats in the cellar. Well, yeah, okay, we've all been there. And we know that's a tradition, but let's change it from rats in the cellar. Let's change it to something's been digging into the food stocks. Somebody's been digging up the local earth clamps, raiding the food, because that's a problem. You leave those open, that food goes rotten, people starve to death over winter. So we're going to tear up this sterile farmland, and these row upon row of densely packed houses that your world map may well be populated by. And we're going to look at how real medieval gardening and farming methods can make your world richer, more tactical, and significantly more grounded. We want our players to care about the peasants, because they're supposed to be heroes, right? And they're less likely to be murder hobos if they actually understand the day-to-day struggles these people have. So your typical medieval peasant garden was a self-sustaining, zero-cost ecosystem designed to feed a household all year round on roughly 1/4 of an acre of land. That's kind of average sort of size garden that you would have. Every element was cyclical, relying on repurposed household waste, living infrastructure, inherited biological assets, and that's really important. They are not going out and purchasing supplies. They don't have the money for that. So let's start with what was grown. All right, so the initial biggest myth in the medieval worlds that we create as part of our fantasy games is the endless fields of wheat. Doesn't mean you can't have them, but what do we mean by endless fields of wheat? Well, whenever they stop at a roadside cottage in D&D, Pathfinder, etc., us DMs, we usually describe golden fields of grain swaying in the breeze. It's very romantic and everything else. But for a common peasant family living on this half-acre kind of plot, grain is not what kept them alive. That is not their main food source. Grain goes to the miller as a tithe and to the local lord's tax collector. It is not what your average peasant is using for day-to-day food. It is generally going off to the army, make breads and things like that. Doesn't mean the peasants aren't keeping some and aren't doing some of that, but it's not their main food at all. In real medieval inspired setting, human commoners were not growing neat, single heads of iceberg lettuce, or massive gluts of 50 squashes all ripening in the same week. That's a logistical nightmare. Think about it. All of your pumpkins all ripen at the same time. Brilliant. You harvest all those pumpkins. You can't store them. They're going to go rotten. You only need to, certainly for people in the West with the Western Halloween tradition of carving pumpkins and things, within a week after Halloween, it's just rotten pumpkins everywhere. They don't last. They rot, of course they do. And people generally aren't even bothering to store them. We're an incredibly wasteful society, certainly in the West. We are. Don't argue with me. We are. But without refrigeration, yeah, that's what you're left with. You don't want that. That doesn't make sense. You cannot afford to waste growing space on stuff that is going to rot. So instead, the entire diet of these individuals revolved around what is called like a cut and come again method. So where you are harvesting what you need, but you're leaving the plant intact. And that means a lot of what you're harvesting is actually things like brassicas and alliums. Think about wheat. Once wheat's ready, you harvest it, you thresh it, and then you've got to store that wheat. Grain goes rotten. You've got rats and rodents that want to eat it. If you turn it into flour, even if you turn it into bread, it doesn't last particularly long. It's not a great food source for seeing you through the winter. It's just not. But plants that you can pick the leaves, you can eat them, and then come back the next day and it's grown more. Brilliant. Perfect. Sustainable living. So what kind of plants are we talking about? We're talking about perennial kales, halfy leafy beets, things like chard, thick leeks, pungent field garlic, things like that. You don't pull the whole plant out of the ground. You walk back out with a small knife, you cut off the bits that you need, and you leave the rest of it in the soil wherever possible. So you do not want to harvest the whole plant. If you can help it, you're harvesting bits, let it carry on growing. That one plant will provide food throughout the entire season. From about March all the way through to the first frosts of winter. And of course, we already mentioned there's ways to extend that a bit further. You would have grown beans and peas that you can harvest as and when they ripe off their pods, and these are all ready to go. And of course, it keeps producing all through that season. You can just harvest what you need when you need it. And where are you putting this stuff when you harvest it? This is all going into the family cauldron or pot for the pottage. So we kind of mentioned about pottage previously in one of these videos, talking about foodstuffs. Your pottage is a pot of stuff, whatever's going in there, whatever is ready and what is available. Yes, there could be meat going in there if you've got it, if you have had to, kill one of your animals, etc. Or you are doing a bit of hunting on the side and you've got a bit of rabbit to go in it. But the eternal pot on the stove is mostly harvesting from your garden what is ready and putting it into the pot. You've heard of peas pottage, but that can be anything. Pottage is just stuff that's in a pot, and you just keep adding to it. So you're going to be putting in herbs for flavour, you're going to be putting in your kales, you're going to be putting in your beets, you're going to be putting all of those things. And yes, you will put in things like root vegetables as and when they are ready, so your turnips and things like that. So every single morning, straight into the cauldron. That's there, simmering almost indefinitely, always on the go, and that is where you're eating. Most of your meals are coming straight out of that pot. Of course, it's not just those vegetable type plots. We've also got orchards. But there's the well-building detail that changes the way that your fantasy orchards work. Did you know apples do not grow from true apple seeds? That's not the way that works at all, and hasn't done for hundreds of years. And this is covered in John Gardner's work. I thought this grafting idea was something quite modern to make particular, just messing with stuff. No, this is a medieval technique. You may well have heard of grafting, but we'll talk about that a bit more. If you plant a plain apple seed in the dirt, nurture it, etc., what you're going to get is an apple tree that has crab apples, which are sour and not really good for eating at all. But they're good for making hard ciders or feeding to pigs. But that's about it. Humans, really, you don't want to be eating them. If you want to get a nice, sweet, edible apple that you're kind of used to put in your apple pie, or drying, so you've got a tasty snack throughout the winter, which is an excellent way to preserve your apples, you have to graft it. Every single named apple, whether it's Granny Smith's, etc., every single named apple variety in a human village is a living clone, passed down through physical cuttings of other trees, from family to family, from village to village, abbey to abbey, for hundreds of years. These are not, I mean, well, there are new varieties, but some of these varieties are hundreds and hundreds of years old. I know a lot of our audience are in the US. A lot of these are way older than the US. They've been around for, literally hundreds and hundreds of years, passed down from family to family. So an ancient orchard on the edge of a fiefdom isn't just a selection of trees, and this is where it comes important in D&D to understand this, or can be if you want to go to that level of detail. Because that's an inherited family heirloom, this orchard, it's not something you can just replant and grow. There's an awful lot of effort, selection, things that go into this process. If a band of raiding hobgoblins comes through and destroys your orchard, it has not destroyed one season's worth of food. Absolutely not. It's just raised 200 years, 300 years of ancestral graft lines that cannot be replaced. That's it. They're gone. You may have to start that line again. You may have other ones that you can go and take cuttings from and graft, but you're starting again. So this is really important, that this now becomes a horrifically valuable asset to any village or family that has an orchard or even a single apple tree. These things are really, really important, and they're really, really costly to lose. So now you can have a battle over an orchard where the players are trying to save the orchard because it is economically so important to that village. And of course, around this plot, whether it's the orchard, whether it's the garden, whether it's a combination of both, because you would probably have as much, fit as much into your garden space, your half acre or whatever it is you've got, fit in as much as possible. Around the edge, you're going to have your bees, the real workers of the garden, your pollinators and things like that. And once again, human farms and gardens did not have wooden hive boxes with removable frames that you can slot in and slot out to easily access the honey and the wax. No, they were kept in things called straw skeps. I'm pretty sure I've said that right. Dense woven domes placed all along the perimeter of the garden that the bees lived in. Honey was the only concentrated sweetener a commoner would be able to get hold of, or probably ever taste in their entire life. That was it. There isn't sugarcane. Again, your D&D world, do what you like. It might be, shipped in from a faraway continent, etc. It may well be available really readily, etc. But we're talking about that medieval realism. Honey is really, really key. And of course, beeswax. We did a video about lighting, and we talked about using animal fats and stuff for reed lights, rush lights, and candle making. If you want high quality candles that don't stink of animal carcass, you want beeswax, and that's sort of a premium. So as a peasant, if I'm collecting my little bits of honey that I can get and I'm collecting beeswax, I've got a choice. I can use that beeswax myself. Now, bearing in mind, beeswax has lots and lots of things you can do with it, for polishing wood, for protecting things, but of course also for making candles. Are you going to make your own candles with your beeswax, or are you going to be selling that beeswax for that really important coinage? Again, depends on the individual family, depends how much they need the money. Most people would be selling that wax on if they could, because then they're able to use that extra bit of coinage to supplement their diet. The luxury of wax candles, it's not something that is important enough to your average peasant who's trying not to die. So that wax is really, really important source of revenue. How do you use this at your table for this part of it? So the next time your players are, they search through a human peasant's garden, and they're out in the yard looking for clues or taking cover during a skirmish or whatever it might be, don't just give them an empty plot of land. You can describe a thick tangle of choked garden that's pungent with wild garlic, 5 foot tall flowering kales that break up line of sight. The rogue might be hiding behind behind a group of these woven straw skeps, knowing that if an arrow pierces one of these skeps and misses the rogue, hits one of the skeps, there's suddenly going to be a swarm of angry bees attacking everything and anything within a kind of a 10-foot radius or maybe bigger. So there's suddenly a hazard hiding in this garden from just being annoyed by bees or something like that. So you can absolutely bring this to life, and it's just a garden, but it's now has tactical pros and cons. You can make the food more personable as well. Make the crops tangible. Once the party starts to realise how hard these families are working just to keep that pottage pot on the fire with enough food in to feed themselves and not starve, especially over the winter, protecting the village from those raiding goblins, from that drought, from that flood, from that evil wizard, the zombie army, whatever it is, suddenly becomes really, really important. You're not just, oh, we need to save the people. You need to save the infrastructure as well. So what is it we're actually going to find in this garden when we have a look at it? Well, we're going to find leaf and pottage crops, as we've already said. Kale, cabbages, beets like chard, leeks and stuff like that as well. We're also going to find alliums and roots like onions, garlic, parsnips and turnips. Now, remembering that we're basing our stuff on England 1440, what was actually happening here, we've got no potatoes, we've got no corn. They didn't come over, of course, they've come from the Americas. We don't have them, or we didn't have them at that point. Therefore, they shouldn't be included if you are doing a England or at least Northern European type of setting. Do whatever you like. Again, I know a lot of my audience are in the US, and it might be weird for you to exclude potatoes. Well, don't exclude them then. Take out turnips, replace it by potatoes. Absolutely do that. Have people growing, a clump of sweet corn. It's your game. It's your fantasy world. It's got to feel real to your players. And I know there are people in this. I know there's people in the audience. We've certainly got a few people from places like Portugal who might be going, well, it was very, very different here. Of course it was. Different climate, a different history, different access to resources. So make it work for your players. But a lot of us are in Northern Europe. I know there's quite a few people from Germany, etc. I think Germany is the second highest audience after the US on my channel. So a lot of this is going to make sense to them as well. But they will have local things that are different, of course. The point is think about how alive that garden is and how important that is. What else is going to be in that garden? Because I got slightly distracted again, of course, because that's what I do. Herbs and companion flowers. So fragrant culinary herbs we're going to be growing. We're going to be growing medicinal type plants. Now, I'm not saying they have medicinal properties. I'm saying they were believed to have medicinal properties. You can argue in the comments what does and what doesn't. But there's lots of those things, St. John's wort and all sorts of stuff that would be classified as those. But they may well also be growing various plants for flowers to deter pests, and also, for seasoning. Citronella candles. There's a reason you burn citronella candles, to keep away midges, mozzies, mosquitoes, and those kind of small biting insects. There's lots of plants that will do that and will keep certain pests. So intermingled with your food crops is going to be other plants that are grown specifically because they deter those kind of pests away from your food crops. And when it comes to fruits, your grafted heritage apples, pears, plums. Those are big things in the medieval world. Things like blackberries from brambles and things like those kind of fruits are much more likely to be foraged rather than grown in your garden. But those fruit trees, plums, apples, pears, you are likely to find at least one or two of those in the garden. Now, bearing in mind, I've got an apple tree in my garden, and each year we can't keep up with the number of apples it produces. That's one tree. So is there a necessity for them to have tree after tree after tree after tree? Probably not. Neighbours going to have one or two apple trees and things like that, so everybody's going to have a few, which can make up effectively an orchard that's spread out across those different gardens anyway. So once again, while there may be a orchard of apple trees, the chances are that is producing apples for an industry like cider rather than for your peasants' food. So gardens are all about feeding the family that owns that garden. Farms are about producing wheat for the army, apples for the cider industry, barley for beer and things like that. So those kind of fields, not owned by the peasants, although worked by the peasants, generally to produce those other goods for other people, their lords and their betters in inverted commas. We mustn't forget, of course, that we've also got things like those pollinators, the honey and beeswax, and we need those kind of flowers to make sure that those bees remain nice and happy as well. So we are going to be ensuring we've got plenty of those kind of wild flowers above and beyond. Now, you all know, if you are a gardener, if you do any gardening, especially if you grow vegetables and things, there's certain things that you grow like runner beans and peas and stuff that will bring the insects anyway. The bees especially, because that's what we're really interested in, bees, because of the wax and the honey. But you're going to want to support those bees as much as possible. The more the bees are supported, the more bees there are, the more honey there is, the more wax there is. It's perfectly simple. So this whole garden is a machine that works together. If you look at modern gardens, they don't work like that. For some reason, even in our modern gardens, we have rows of carrots, rows of onions, rows of this. We don't do this kind of planting where we are supporting the plants themselves by using other natural elements. We tend to be using sterile things. It's a bit weird. I don't know where we went wrong and why we've got so lost in our own gardens when it comes to those who choose to grow food. But we try to treat them like mini farms. Oh, I've got to fertilise them. Oh, I've got to do this. I've got to do that. They've got to be in neat rows. It's a nonsense. And we've lost that from history. We've lost that technique and that skill. All right, let's move on from this chapter. We're going to talk more about how these things were grown. Okay, so how do we actually get this garden working, this machine that is our garden? Now, first of all, right back to the beginning where we talked about these are living enclosures. Get rid of your white picket fences, your 6-foot panelled fence and all of that. One, they didn't exist in that kind of format. Two, that's a heck of a lot of effort to make a fence, and anything that is made of dead wood will rot. So your white picket fence, and you'll know if you go now and you say you want to do a white picket fence, you're picking woods and materials that are pressure treated and chemically treated, and they're stained with various chemicals and things to stop them rotting, none of which these people really had access to. So putting up a wooden fence was just a stupid idea. It's like you put so much time, effort and resource into it and the damn thing's going to rot. Don't do it. So what do? Living hedges and fences. It really is that simple. It's like, well, why should I put all that effort in when nature will do that for me? So they are living enclosures protected by laid hedges. Now, we could do an entire video on how to lay hedges because it's absolutely fascinating. But this comprises of plants like hawthorn and blackthorn, willow and hazel, where you can actually get these to grow in a very specific type of way through various, what it's called laying. You can cut them, you can bend them over, you can weave them into temporary stakes that will enable them to grow in a particular way. And you get a really dense barrier that's very hard to get through. Now, if you know anything about hawthorn and blackthorn, you do not want to be running through one of those hedges because they've got thorns, like proper thorns on a blackthorn, like big, like inch-long stabby things. You don't want to do that. I've got a hawthorn and I've got a blackthorn in my garden, and all the time when I'm trimming and pruning them and I'm shaping them because I'm growing them literally along a fence to create a barrier, I get jabbed by a damn thing all the time. Now remember, blackthorn also produces sloes. So we've got berries coming off of our blackthorn. It's not just a hedge, which is great. And hawthorn is producing haws, not that kind of haw. Stop giggling at the back. And again, haws are useful. They have medicinal properties and things like that. And you can use them, you can boil them up and make haw syrups and jams and things like this as well. So even this living hedge is providing us with fruits that we can use. So our living enclosures, where we've got these fences, these hedges that are creating dense protection from deer wandering into our gardens and eating our crops. Keeping rabbits and rodents out is nigh on impossible, but any of those bigger things, those bigger grazing animals, they ain't getting in. You're going to be able to hold them off with this natural barrier that is also producing fruits and things like that. And once you've laid that, that can last hundreds of years. Now, even in the UK, depending where you go, certainly the further up north you go in the UK, you encounter more and more dry stone walls, which are more about keeping animals penned than they are about protecting personal gardens and things like that. Certainly in the south, hedgerows were the most common way of doing that. But you can have a mixture, and if you want to show in your world some changes and differences, look up dry stone walls, especially if you're not in the UK. Just Google England dry stone walls, and oh right, that suddenly makes sense. It's a very, very different landscape. So you can create these cultural differences throughout your D&D or Pathfinder or any other fantasy gaming world like that. Our actual crops themselves are most likely within this garden going to be grown on these narrow raised beds made of woven wattle, so sticks and mud. So again, that willow and hazel weaved together to make what look like baskets, but they are permanent features. Makes it nice and easy because it's raised up off the ground. It helps keep some predators out, makes it harder for certain things to get there, but it's easier to weed and it's easier to harvest. You haven't got to keep getting down on your knees, and as you're walking around these beds, you're not constantly compacting the soil with your feet, so it provides better drainage and things like that as well. So actually the crops grow better. Everyone's a winner. How are we fertilizing these things? Well, we're not shipping in fertilizer. We're not popping down to the local garden center to get these things. Our gardens are fueled by composted household scraps. We are taking ash from the hearth, or potash, as you will have heard. And you can go to the garden center and you can go and buy potash. Why would you, when you're cooking and heating from an open fire? You are producing your own ash every single day. We are not going to the garden centre to buy fertiliser. It's right there. Crushed shells. So if you have a coastal region or you've got access to chalks and things like that, you absolutely can be using these materials crushed up to add to your garden to provide nutrients. But when it comes to the nitrogen side, this is what often it comes like, oh, this is the animal fertilizer. This is coming from. There's a number of different ways that you can do this and get your nitrogen in. But in medieval times, a really common way was pigeon poo. Um, so you would keep a dovecote. Not necessarily, I guess dovecote is a broad term, but you might not keep doves in it. But you might have doves, but you might keep pigeons, you might keep any kind of birds like that that are going to produce lots and lots of dung. And that is going to go back into that garden. Is there a case of using human waste? Probably not, because it's unpleasant to work with, but you will have heard of middens. These things will be collected, and things like human waste often will go off to places like the tanneries and things like that. It has an industrial usage for it. But pigeon poo, kitchen scraps, all of those things, all into the compost heap or goes directly into the land, mixed into your fresh bed before you do your planting, to provide all of those nutrients. And of course, any inedible parts of the plant, they don't go in the bin, they don't go into a landfill, they go into your compost, or they go into your animals. If you're keeping geese, you might be tempted to say, oh, you're keeping chickens. No chickens. Not in medieval England anyway. No chickens. We haven't got them yet. But geese was the thing. So you feed them to your geese. You might feed them to your pigs if you are well off enough to have your own pigs, etc. We are also going to make sure that our crops are, and I mentioned it before, this thing called intercropping. So crops grown in tangled polycultures rather than single crop rows. You don't have a row of carrots. What this does is naturally shades out weeds, because you've got different heights of plants in different ways doing different things. Yes, they are competing with each other, but again, you've got that confusion of scents coming from a mixture of plants. It makes it harder for those pests to identify, oh, there's a lovely tasty row of cabbages there, I'm going to head straight for it, because those cabbages are intermingled with other stuff. So it does give a layer of protection from those kind of pests. So that's a really good idea, right? And also it helps conserve moisture, because you've got less bare soil where that moisture is just escaping from. Again, even if you don't have your own vegetable plot, I'm sure you have seen one. You can go see in the UK, we certainly have things called allotments. And I believe in Germany you have something very similar, and I cannot remember what you call them. But they're like communal gardens where individuals might own a spot of that, or it might be a group of people who work together. But when you look at them, all of our vegetables are in rows, and most of the ground is bare soil. And most of the time spent in them is weeding to keep the crops keep the crops healthy and get rid of those competing plants. Those competing plants should be useful plants, and then you don't need to weed, do you? Right? Because the crops will, your plants that you want will cover those areas. Season bedding and hotbeds. So using things like manure, fresh horse manure in particular, is very, very useful. That's going to rot down, because that rotting composting process produces heat. And if we're producing heat, we can keep plants warm. So we can keep plants warm even when the first frost starts to hit, and we can keep those things growing. So any of that decaying process, part of your compost bin, the reason why your compost bin works is because it's really warm in the middle of that compost bin. All those bacteria are working away, breaking down your stuff into effectively what becomes a very highly nutritious type of soil. That's why you compost stuff. Duh. And then you can put that onto your garden. But that generates an awful lot of heat. So these this ability to stack around plants decomposting material, not only is that providing food as it breaks down, but it creates warmth and allows your plants to grow and therefore produce food longer, especially around your brassicas, your cabbages and your kales and your things like that, which is really, really useful. If you can get an extra 4 weeks out of your crop, that's 4 weeks less of winter that you need to find other food for or store food for. And of course, as we mentioned before, the idea about this cut and come again harvesting, where you cut the leaves and things that you need, but you leave the plant there. So yes, root vegetables, if you're eating the root, that needs to come up, but you're not harvesting them all at the one time and storing them. You're harvesting what you need. And a lot of root vegetables is you can chop a chunk of that off and actually reuse the plant, and it will carry on. A lot of you will have done things like, possibly as part when you're in primary school, you chop the carrot off and then you put it in some water and the carrot stays alive and it produces, new roots, and off it goes. You can replant those things. You're not just throwing away those heads or composting them. Actually, you can use them to create additional plants that go back into the soil, become new carrots. You don't necessarily need everything to go to seed, which is another good point. Because we are harvesting these plants as we go, and we're not digging out and taking the whole lettuce out, which kills it. Actually, as the year goes on, not only are we getting our food leaves from these brassicas, etc., but they are allowed to also go to seed. We're still harvesting the edible bits. They can go to seed, and there you have your seeds for your next planting. So again, chopping the whole cabbage out and harvesting it like modern harvesting methods is actually stupid. It's ridiculous. Why do we do that? Because shipping a whole cabbage, it's easier to harvest the whole thing and ship the whole cabbage and let you pull off the leaves yourself. But as you all know, a lot of the time when you buy cabbages and things like that from the supermarket, you get a couple of manky leaves on the outside. Oh, you take those off and throw those away because they're a bit manky and they've got a few holes in and who knows what's been on them. And then you're left with another layer or two that have got pretty good leaves, and then they start to get denser and denser and denser. Hang on a minute, how much of this cabbage have you actually used and is what you would consider to be just about right for edibility? You're wasting so much of it, or using bits of the cabbage that you don't think. If that was left in the ground, you're taking those outer leaves off when they are nice and fresh and ready. Excellent. That is your meal for today. And within a few days, those next leaves that are now on the outside are ready for harvesting. And then a few days after that, the next leaves are ready for harvesting. So you're always getting the best quality food out of that cabbage without ever digging it up. And it still goes to seed at the end of the day, and you've still got your next planting lot. It's just so obvious. It makes me cross how rubbish we are in the 21st century with the way that we choose to treat food. It's bonkers. 1440, they're doing it right, and we've lost all of this. It's crazy. So yes, we need to make sure that we're getting off track, getting slightly ranty about this. But yeah, so we need to kind of bear in mind that this is how our gardens are. So they can be neat and tidy because you've got these raised, wattled beds with paths through. They don't have to be absolute chaos. They can be well laid out. They might be in strips, they might be in squares, but it gives you room to walk around them. And of course, if they're off the ground, I mentioned earlier about the fencing and it will keep out the deer and stuff like that, and rabbits are coming through. Well, if they're a good couple of feet off the ground, the rabbits are going to struggle to get up there and eat all of your lovely veg as well. So it's providing a level of defence by having them off the ground. You're not crushing the ground and compacting all the soil and everything else like that. So all of these things together creates a very functional as well as visual kind of space that you can use in your D&D, Pathfinder, your fantasy adventures, and just create this image of this is what it's like. But with this level of detail, you can then explain what kind of plants are in there when the druid inevitably goes poking and goes, well, what's this then, what's this then, what's this then, what are they growing in here? And a lot of the time as a DM we go, oh yeah, it's a field of carrots, and that's it. If you're suddenly able to turn around and go, well, actually, it's a massive mix of different plants. It includes alliums. There are onions in here, and there are, all of these brassicas and, different things like that. In fact, you can see just off to your right, a few feet away, somebody has a small woven basket with them, and they are harvesting individual leaves, very carefully selecting what they are cutting with a small knife and adding them to their basket, clearly gathering food for the pottage pot. That person is now doing something real in your world that makes sense within the context. Rather than go, oh yeah, there's a farmer and he's ploughing. Uh, Great. Do you know what I mean? Not a lot of detail. All right, we're going to move on to talk about some of the tools and things available. All right, so we know what our garden kind of looks like. We know its structure. We know what we're growing, and we know why we're growing it. But what are we using tools-wise? Because obviously, we've got lots of modern tools and stuff like that. And you'll already be familiar with quite a lot of these tools because they get turned into peasant weapons. So a lot of your fantasy characters are already walking around with war versions of these kind of tools and stuff like that, brush axes and things like that. What else? So things like coppicing hooks, grafting knives, so lots of small type of knives that you would use for harvesting, but also coppicing hooks. And we haven't really talked about what coppicing is, which is quite important. So if you take a tree, and things like willow and hazel are really good for this. If you cut it, chop the top off, it will sprout from the base and it will send up lots of new shoots. Now what those new shoots do is they all grow into nice, decent, sturdy kind of poles. So once they get to a size where you go, oh, that's a really useful size pole, or a decent length that I can use to weave into a fence to make that wicker fence, you cut it. And therefore you've got this nice usable that's either, with a pole shave and scrape all the bark off and turn that into a pole, whether that is for minor construction for pig pen, using for a stake for fencing, potentially using them for walking sticks and staffs and things like that. If you cut them a bit smaller, they're still really flexible, especially with willow. You're then able to weave those in between those stakes and things. And of course, because of the nature of those plants, when you cut that off, it just shoots out more from the base. So by continually managing those and not having a core trunk, you can harvest and harvest year after year after year, and you've got an endless supply of those. So coppicing hooks are basically a kind of a special kind of curved axe that's designed for doing exactly that job and for chopping those willowy branches off to use for those. So we've got those kind of tools, axes, coppicing hooks, and things like that you need for maintaining your trees, your coppiced trees, as well as things like your fruit trees, etc. We're going to have things like digging forks. So you know what a garden fork looks like, even if you don't have a garden. I'm sure you know what a garden fork looks like. We've got big ones, we've got small ones, we've got hand ones. These are going to be really, really common. All gardens are going to have something of that ilk. Are we going to have things like hay pitchforks, hay forks and things? Not unless you're growing an awful lot. So there might be the local farm that is dealing with straw and hay for animal feed and bedding and things, but your local garden, you don't need that. That's just not going to be something you require. But you are going to have lots of these small wooden and iron hand tools for things like turning over your compost, for digging over the soil, for helping, dibbers for creating holes for new plants and for seeds to be dropped into. Simple things like that. But most of it is going to be a series of knives and bladed implements for cutting, chopping and slicing. And of course your grafting knives, which are for very delicately cutting into the tree, enabling you to bond together your new part of the plant with the rooted existing one. I'm not going to go into lots of details of how grafting works. You can go and look that up. Google grafting, tree grafting. You'll see one image and you go, oh, I get it now. It really is that simple. And of course, they are going to have in this garden lots of things that they need for carrying stuff. Wicker and woven baskets. You've got your straw skeps for the bees and things like that. Are they tools? Well, yeah, baskets are tool for carrying things, for carrying your produce. You're going to have some for moving compost and moving animal dung, your horse manure, or whatever it is that your little village or your individual house is using for its fertilizer. You may well have some metal like metal scoops and things for dealing with potash from the fire to make sure that gets mixed in, etc. So litter your gardens with a few basic tools. Remember, they can't just pop down the road and buy a new one. They don't have the money. Tools and things are going to be well looked after. They are really, really important. Yes, you can replace wooden handles and things like that, but you don't want things like your forks and stuff. You don't just leave them laying around in the garden. They are going to be put away and cared for. Same with your baskets. You're not going to leave them out in all sorts of weather. They're going to be indoors. So if you want a garden to feel alive, put a couple of people out there working, give them a basket, give them a tool, give them a job that they are doing within that garden. If they are not in the garden, don't put the tools in there as well. Keep them hidden away. All right. So the next thing we need to look at, of course, is what happens once we've done all this harvesting. Apart from the stuff that's going straight into the pottage pot, we're going to have a little look at earth clamps, storage, and things like that. So in your fantasy worlds and gardens, just like in the real world, people need to eat throughout the winter, which is not the growing season. Now, in our modern world, certainly in the West, we just ship stuff in, right? We ship it in, and we've got modern technology which allows us to grow summer vegetables all year round and things like that. Comes with a cost to the planet, to overuse of fertilizers and all of that. Without getting into that, our medieval people did not have that luxury. They could not have done that even if they wanted to, and they've got no refrigeration. So this is where earth clamps come in. And this is specifically about things like root vegetables and cabbages, where you can stack them on the ground in mounds, so a pile of turnips or whatever that might be, and you cover them with straw. So again, suddenly we have straw, have a usage for that. Of course, it doesn't necessarily mean to be wheat straw. It could be barley straw, etc. But we're going to cover them with a thick insulator of straw and then pack it with earth. So this is going to create a sealed unit. We don't want it to be completely sealed. It does need to breathe. So usually out the top of it, you would have a good fistful of straw that sticks out the top like a chimney that allows air to move in and out of this earth-sealed chamber. So this allows breathing, which stops rot, but this will also help keep the temperature within the earth clamp itself just above freezing throughout the winter. So it will help keep it warm but not hot. So these things will be preserved. They're not freezing because it has ventilation. They're not rotting. You hope. There's always a risk. But an earth clamp, if your adventurers are wandering around this town and it is in the late autumn, it's into the early winter, they might see peasants building these earth clamps by stacking up all these root vegetables together, layering on thick blobs of straw and then covering it with earth. Now, the brilliant thing about a earth clamp is throughout that winter, there's no point in storing the food if you can't get at it. So what you can do is you can just open one end of it when you need to, and you can take some out, and then you can pack it and reseal it. So it's a bit like a larder, a little bit like your fridge. You open it, you take what you need, you close it again. Now, your chances are you're going to take a few days worth or a week's worth at a time, so you're not having to keep opening it, keep sealing it. That's inefficient. And certainly most of your root vegetables will last a week. But there's a good chance those root vegetables are going straight in the pottage anyway. and will be used over that week as you're pulling out chunks of it. Run out, you can go back to your earth clamp, you can grab a few more, again, chop them up straight into your pottage pot and to give you that boost all through the winter, which is fantastic. Again, no refrigeration, all done in your own garden, and it gives you that preservation. Things like your hardy kales though, so a lot of your green vegetables, you can leave them in the ground over winter and continue harvesting them, even during frosts. The frost is a real danger to the new leaves and new plants. These have been growing all year and they are established. Yes, you might not get a lot of new growth off of them once the temperature starts to drop, but if you haven't taken the whole plant out, you can actually leave them in place and you can still harvest, certainly for the first half of the winter, still be harvesting those fresh leaves that are on that plant and putting them into your pottage pot. So don't forget about that. Just because it's like, oh, it's autumn, it's harvest season, chop everything, the whole garden is bare. You wouldn't do it. It makes no sense. So you can carry on harvesting those kind of things. And of course, we need to prepare for spring, because there's no point eating our entire crop and having nothing left for the next season, because otherwise next winter you're going to die. We got to keep this rotation going and make sure we've always got fresh plants growing, etc. So what we do is the strongest and most disease resilient plants that we have left in the garden as we head into that autumn, we are absolutely going to make sure that those ones are allowed to go to seed. Don't eat that one. That's a really, really good one. Don't eat that one. That one's going to go to seed. That is the one that we're going to collect our seed from so that we can store somewhere dry. This is where we're going to have something like a sealed earthenware pot. We can seal that. We're going to keep it on a shelf or above the ground. We want to keep mice and things away from it, so that we've got our seeds ready for planting next year. And when we get to planting next year, how are we going to do that? So we may well have, so again, we go into this peasant's house and there's a shelf and it's got lots of little earthenware jars on that the family seem very protective over. Must be their valuables, right? It is their valuables. It's seeds for the next season. It's not gold. It's not jewelry. It's not any of those things. The most precious thing they've got at this time of the year is the seed that makes sure that they have something to eat or something to plant in the springtime. So suddenly we've got a very different dynamic on what this family sees as important. How are we going to plant those seeds come the next spring, though? Are we going to put them in nice, neat rows? No, we're not going to put them in nice, neat rows, and we are not going to plant them all at the same time. If you plant all of your carrots at the same time, all of your carrots are ready to be harvested at about the same time. We don't want to do that, because then we've got to store them and they might go rotten, and then we've only got them for a particular period. So as soon as the first frosts have finished, we start planting, and we plant a few, and then a few days later we plant a few, and then a few days later we plant a few, and we do that throughout the year. So all of our, for not just, I mentioned carrots, but for all of them, for our brassicas, for our alliums, you know, our onions, our garlic, etc. We don't plant everything in one go. We plant a bunch, and we might do one of our raised beds and do that with a variety of all the different plants. And then next week we do another one of those beds. And then a week after we do another one of those beds. So all of our plants, our foods, are maturing and are ready to eat at different times throughout that year. So we are able to harvest right early on, sort of from March onwards. For some of those early plants, we can start picking straight away, all the way through right until September, October, and if the frosts are good to us, into November. And again, we've got those techniques of using things like manure to keep some of those plants going even into that early frost season. So there's an awful lot of information in this video about how these gardens work and stuff like that. And you might just go, I don't care about any of this. That's fine. If you've got to this point in the video and you don't care about it, Sorry for wasting this much of your time, but you could have stopped any time you like. But for those of you who want to create this much better living world, this is a really good way to do it. We've got what people are eating, and now we've got what they are doing on a day-to-day basis, tending these gardens and what these gardens look like, and the types of plants that are in them. Really does bring it to life. What it starts to also say is that big farm that all those peasants are working on, you want your players to kind of realise and go, they are working their absolute butts off in those fields. That's not for them to eat. That's not their food. That's what they have to do for the Lord to allow them to live on this land. Pretty much. I mean, that's a gross generalisation, but that's pretty much what you're looking at. Yeah, they get some of that, but a lot of it they won't. Nearly everything that they are eating is from their own sustainable garden, which is pretty cool. So I think we need to do a video like this. It'll be much shorter, but going, well, hang on, what about dwarves though? Because dwarves are not all above ground, and they are not all in their lovely cottage gardens, following these kind of rules. What the heck are they eating? What the heck are they drinking? And how are they producing it? Of course, dwarves do not exist in the real world. No, there aren't fairies at the end of your garden, as much as the fun as that would be. So we are definitely into a massive segue, and definitely into fantasy with that. And because again we're talking about fantasy role-playing games, none of this you have to apply, and you can introduce plants that don't exist, make them up completely different. If you want potatoes in your garden, you can. If you want them growing mushrooms and things, that you can, but don't steal my thunder on when we get to the elven gardens and stuff like that, and the dwarven ones. You can do what you like, but trying to create this real world. And hopefully this video has given you a place to start with that, and given you, hang on a minute, we can base it on the real world and then throw in a few crops that are magical. Maybe they have got a greenhouse. Maybe in your world glass is quite abundant, they've got that. Maybe there's a particular type of magic. Maybe there's, every village has a druid, and that druid is actually comes round and helps with pest control and all of those things, but the essentials remain the same. The idea of harvesting all the way through the year. Anyway, I hope you found this interesting. I suspect you have if you've got this far in the video. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for all my patrons. That I really appreciate that. That makes a huge, huge difference. If you are interested in seeing my take on things like dwarven, what dwarves are eating and how they're getting that food, what elves are eating and how they're getting that food, etc. Drop a comment, let me know. You know, if everybody says, yeah, really interested in dwarves, don't give a darn about elves, probably won't do one. If you're all much more interested in what goblins are eating rather than dwarves, maybe we'll do that. And we'll look a bit more into kind of goblin society, and let's make goblins real people. Thank you for watching. I am the Clay Golem. I will see you in the next one.